I was always interested in natural history when I was growing up. My family did a lot of camping and hiking during the summers when I lived in California. And so I was always kind of interested in plants and probably more interested in flowering plants than anything else at the time. And as an undergraduate at University of California, Davis, I majored in botany. So study of plants, obviously. And my senior year, I took a class called California Mushrooms that taught a little bit about mushrooms, but a lot about actually cultivation. And so for a couple of years after that, I thought I was actually going to go into the mushroom cultivation industry. And I applied for several jobs as a mushroom grower and was hired at none of them. So yeah, kind of disappointing. I thought, wow, what's the matter with me? But the last person that I interviewed with who didn't hire me turned out to be a master's degree student at San Francisco State University. And we got to talking. And he said, you know, if you're really interested in fungi, you ought to go up and see this guy named Harry Tiers at San Francisco State. So I sent Harry a letter, and he sent me a letter back and said, you know, if you're thinking about mushrooms, come and talk to me. And so I did, and before I knew it, he had me talked into a master's degree program. And so I started studying mushrooms in California. And then when I was finishing up my master's degree, I thought, you know, I'd really like to do this for the rest of my life. And so then I started looking at PhD programs. And I ended up moving to University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And then after I finished there, I came here, Central Illinois. We don't exactly know how long fungi have been around from a geological timescale. We can estimate using molecular biology. So there's what's called a molecular clock. And the molecular clock basically allows you to tell how soon the sequence of bases are that are in a gene, how quickly those change. And so if you see so many changes occurring, then you can estimate how old they are. And most people would estimate that fungi are somewhere between 1 billion and 1.5 billion years old. So one of the primary roles that they have in nature is decomposition and nutrient recycling. So this time of the year, we see all the leaves all over the place on the ground. And yet what I like to tell students is if you go out in the following spring or early summer, most of those leaves are gone. Well, where did they go? They didn't just vanish. Well, they did in a way, but it's the fungi and bacteria and other organisms that are breaking them down. And the same thing with a tree that falls down. So if you own some property, here's a little project for you. You can watch a tree fall, after a tree falls on your property, just watch it over time and see how long it takes it to decay. But that's basically being done by fungi. So all those nutrients need to be recycled. We don't have new nutrients coming into our environment, so we have to recycle everything. And so that's a really important role for them. They're pathogenic organisms, so a lot of them grow as pathogens on plants. And of course, that's a concern if you're a farmer. A lot of things attack corn and soybeans in our area. So that's a constant concern for farmers. And we're learning more and more about fungi that can actually be pathogens of humans as well, which is sort of a scary thing to think about. And then some fungi form symbiotic relationships with plants, so it's a mutual association. The fungus associates with the roots of the plants, and the fungus gets a food supply from the plant, and in exchange the plant gets facilitated nutrient and water uptake. So there's really a lot of roles that they carry out in our environment. Yeah, generally considered to be the largest organism. So the above ground portion of the mushrooms that we see is only one small part of it. The rest of it's all underground. And so if it's kind of the analogy, I think, of picking a fruit off a tree. So you pick the fruit, but the tree is still there. And so you pick the mushroom, but the rest of it's underground. And back in the 1980s, they found a thing up in Michigan that they referred to as the humongous fungus, which took up, I don't remember how many football fields. It was some massive thing. And then they estimated it to be several thousand years old. And so it turned out to be the oldest and largest living organism, and now has been replaced by an even more humongous fungus out in Oregon. And they're a very diverse group. They're not the most diverse. Insects are more diverse. I mean, there are far more insects than there are fungi, but the estimates are that there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 million species of fungi in the world. We know about 100,000 of them. And so the estimates are that there's a whole bunch more that we don't even know. And of course, one of the things that some of us are concerned about is that these things could go extinct before we ever even realize that they're there. How do we classify a fungus? Yeah, that's one of the first questions that's on one of my mycology exams that I give. So tell me, how would you describe what a fungus actually is? So they are typically filamentous, so they form what we call hyphae, or sometimes if you have a mass of them, it's some mycelium. But just imagine a network of threads growing in the soil or in a rotting log. And if you can do this, you go out into the woods and tear a log apart, and you can see the white threads in the log. And that's the vegetative phase of the fungus, the business end of things, so to speak. And then they produce spores in some way. And there's a lot of different ways they can do that. And then it has to do with their mode of nutrition. So they're heterotrophs, which means that they have to get their organic material from another organism. They can't produce their own. So plants photosynthesize and they produce their own material, but fungi can't do that. There are a lot of things that fall into that category of fungi. And again, with all the research that's going on today, some of those limits of what's a fungus and what isn't a fungus isn't always very clear. But there are things like water molds, which are studied by mycologists. And so if you think of something that caused potato blight in Ireland and caused all the potatoes to die, that was caused by a water mold, which is a fungus. There are things called chytrids, which are also fungi, and they're aquatic. Bread molds that grow on bread. In those days before we bought bread with preservatives in the grocery store. But if you still make your own bread, you can see bread molds. If you've ever bought strawberries and let your strawberries sit out on the counter and come in one day and there's this gray stuff completely covering them, it falls into the category of bread molds. Then there's things like morels in the spring, which of course people around here go crazy for as a food source. And then there's mushrooms. So really a lot of diversity when you think about what fungi really are. And that's one of the things that a lot of people notice about mushrooms, is that they come up very quickly. They don't see them one day, and then the next day they go out and they're all over the place, and then a couple days later they're gone again. And so there's obviously a triggering mechanism between the rainfall and the time of the year and the temperature. All have something to do with it. And so mostly, if you think about it, the mushroom's growing under the ground, it's accumulating all of that food, it's building up a food supply. And so when it rains and the conditions are right, then it converts that food supply into the actual mushrooms that come up out of the ground. Why exactly that happens, we don't know for a lot of mushrooms. I mean, we do for some, because that's why you can find things in the store. So you go to the store and you can see different kinds of mushrooms in the store. But for a lot of them, we don't know. If we did, there'd be a lot more edible fungi, on the shelves in the supermarket, but we just haven't been able to duplicate that yet. Why are there so many? That's a really good question. That's sort of like the idea of why are there so many colors and forms? And I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that, because they're all for the same thing. All those mushrooms we see out in the woods, in all those different forms, they're all doing the same thing. They're producing spores. And that's the role. And nobody knows why fungi do it in so many different ways. You'd think, well, if we can do it one way, why don't we just all do it like that? But they don't. And why are there so many colors? Why are there blue mushrooms? I have no idea why blue. I don't know. We talk about, well, maybe it attracts insects, and the insects eat the mushrooms, or they eat the spores and they carry the spores away and they disperse them, and maybe that's what's happening. But I don't think anybody really knows. So if you were to ask someone, did you know that Eastern Illinois University has 10,000 specimens of fungi? They would say, no, that's not possible. And it's not just Eastern Illinois University. It's a number of institutions that are around the country that are in a similar predicament. So they've had people collecting fungi, lichens, plants, insects, whatever it is, for years and years, and have developed these collections that nobody knows about. And so the National Science Foundation several years ago started a program to basically start to catalog all those kinds of organisms at all those different institutions. And so fungi are just one of them that developed in that way. And so we have a National Science Foundation funded project. And basically what we're doing is taking all of our data, some of it's just in my field books, and that's all being put into an Excel spreadsheet right now. And then it'll be a matter of taking digital images of the labels and the collections in the spring. And then all that'll be loaded into an online database that people will have access to. And there's 30 or 35 institutions that are part of this. And so all that data, which nobody knew about before, by the end of June, all that data should now be available to the public. And so if someone was curious about, well, how many yellow morels are found in Coles County, Illinois, they could go to this data set and they could actually see how many there were. Or maybe they wanted to know something about the distribution of yellow morels in the Midwest. You know, can I find yellow morels in Missouri and Indiana and Iowa and other places, or are they just in Illinois? They could go and they could find out where those things are actually known from. And so it'll give us a lot better idea of natural history as far as what organisms are out there, what sort of geographical distribution they have. And then, you know, other sorts of ecological data, what kind of trees they're associated with, what time of the year should you go look. So if you want to go look for yellow morels in central Illinois, when should you be looking? Which is a thing a lot of people want to know. What makes me a fun guy? Yeah, I've heard all those jokes, yeah. Well, you know, it is one of those sort of things. I mean, when I started off as a student, I mean, I knew some stuff about fungi because I'd taken some classes, but part of it was all the different forms that they come in, shapes and colors and the kinds of substrates that they're on. I mean, I think about them being on plants and on fallen wood and things like that, but you know, I've collected fungi that are growing on insect larvae and just they turn up in the oddest places, and that's one of the things that has always been fascinating for me, is just the number of places that they turn up, and always someplace new. So I've always gotten really interested in that. The last 10 years I've gotten much more interested in medical mycology and interested in fungi that can become pathogens in humans. And I sometimes think, had I known anything about medical mycology when I was a graduate student, I probably would have gone on a completely different path, because I just think that's a fascinating area to think about. You know, we think about bacteria and viruses in the human body all the time, but most of us don't think about fungi. And more people are immunocompromised in some way, and we're finding that they can be attacked not only by bacteria and viruses, but also fungi. And it's a completely different world. And then I like looking at stuff under the microscope. That drives the students crazy, because students generally don't like looking through the microscope. But you know, when I see a mushroom and I'm holding it in my hand, part of me thinks, what does that thing look like underneath the microscope? And there's a whole nother world when you start looking at things underneath the microscope. You know, for me, part of research is just finding out basic information that isn't known. I mean, that's part of the attraction for me, and that's part of the attraction, I think, for the students that have worked in my lab over the years. I've been one of those kind of people that I would rather a student work on a project that they're interested in, as opposed to something that I choose for them, because I want them to be really interested in what it is that they actually do. And so, I mean, I found that, you know, over the years, I have learned all kinds of things from having students doing research in my lab, because we studied something that nobody really looked at before. And we realized, oh, that's something really interesting, and nobody really knew that before. So I like a lot of my research just because I find out things that I didn't know before all the time, and that's the kind of things that I can share with other people. Some of that's in scientific publications, but some of it's in popular literature. I write articles for other kinds of journals. I give talks to mushroom clubs during the year. And so for me, that's a lot of it. I mean, it's just the excitement of finding out things that I didn't know and things that we just didn't know scientifically.
So when I was in my doctoral program, my advisor asked me to teach a class, and I really did not want to do it. I really went to school to be a practitioner and a clinician, so the fact that she made me teach it did not make me happy. And in fact, I made several appointments to go in with her and explain why someone else would do a better job than I did, and and I'm very appreciative for that she did make me teach the class. And once I got in the classroom, I realized this is what I was meant to do. So. And I just noticed that a lot of the kids that I was working with didn't have access to grandparents, and that made me really sad. And I thought of how important that intergenerational communication is. And so how could we as as scientists and practitioners, figure out a way to get that intergenerational communication going again. And so I started kind of looking for ways to incorporate older adults in working with children. And I was fortunate enough to go to the University of North Texas to the Center for Play Therapy and receive some training on the model that I now use and I adapted. And it clicked then that this was it. And I immediately started working on the project on the plane ride home. Play therapy is the systematic use of a theoretical model where trained play therapists use the powers of play to help resolve psychosocial stressors or help kids with mental illnesses. And so there are special toys that are used in play therapy, and the idea of play therapy is that play is a child's language. It's actually their most natural form of expression. So kids inherently like to play, they enjoy it, and it's something that they do a lot of. And so the toys become their language. So my study adapted a really very effective play therapy model called child-parent relationship therapy. And in that model, parents are trained in basic play skills to use with their children 30 minutes a week, and they videotape those sessions, and then they bring them back to a group setting for an hour and a half where they're supervised by a trained play therapist. They play the videos and receive support and feedback in how to improve and have a better relationship with their child. And so I thought, why couldn't we train senior citizen volunteers to do that very same thing and go out into the school setting where kids are just naturally there. There's a lot less stigma associated with being at school. Everybody goes to school, right? And a lot of kids are pulled from classrooms for a variety of reasons. So when a child's pulled from a classroom, there's less stigma associated with it than going to a mental health center. And then lastly, we know that school counselors are completely overburdened. And so, for example, the American School Counseling Association recommends a school counselor ratio of 1 counselor to every 250 kids. What we actually find in practice nationally is 1 child for every 472 children. Here in Illinois, our statistic is even worse. So there's 1 school counselor for every 672 children. And at the site that we utilized, it was 1 school counselor for every 755 children. The statistics are alarming. 1 in 5 children suffer from some type of mental health issue. 80% of those kids don't get the help that they need. So it's interesting because I think a lot of adults assume that because children continue to play and they continue to go throughout their day, that everything's fine. And so you'll often hear adults say, I think they're fine, they're dealing with the death okay because they're playing. But that would really be like saying an adult is okay because they're still talking. Because children use play to communicate, just like adults use talking to communicate. So play is to children what talking is to adults. Well, what we know, developmentally speaking, is that kids don't have the same cognitive capacities as adults do. And so adults oftentimes misunderstand children's behaviors, and they think that kids are acting out and they know why. And really, cognitively speaking, they don't have the ability to think abstractly. So that means in practice that they can't reflect on their own intent, they can't think about different possibilities, and so that's why when parents sit down and ask a child, why did you do this? And they typically say, I don't know, that everyone is kind of frustrated because they don't have the same cognitive capacities that adults have. And so play allows them that bridge between the concrete and the abstract. And so we know that children do best in the present. And so they can use the toys to communicate and express feelings that are difficult to express. So adults, for example, and you've probably had this experience yourself, that it's difficult for many adults to put into words what's going on with them. So they may be struggling and they have a hard time communicating their feelings to other people. And so it's that much more difficult for kids because they actually lack the ability to do that. And so toys allow them a safe distance so that they can play out things that are going on. So it's happening to the panda bear, not to me. It also provides them with a way that's developmentally sensitive to communicate so that they enjoy playing, and it allows them a safe distance as well. We wanted to make sure that we didn't overburden volunteers with really heavy problems. And so we screened all of our children to make sure that they were kind of in that borderline range, that they were struggling with some at-risk behaviors or psychosocial stressors, but they weren't really suffering from a full-blown mental illness. And so we wanted to be really careful because the seniors are not considered to be therapists, but the relationship that they develop is considered to be therapeutic. So even though we really screened heavily the children that were in the study, we still found out that children were suffering from some pretty major problems, such as parental incarceration, homelessness. One of our children became homeless during the study. Domestic violence, and more common things like divorce and death. But what's interesting about the kids that we utilize is that they actually would not have been seen by a therapist had we not been involved. So they were kids that the school counselor had no intention of seeing, although the teacher was noticing that there were some problems. The biggest surprise was how much the senior volunteers' lives were transformed. So one of the women said it best when she said, I may be old and white-haired and creaky in the knees, but it doesn't matter to her. To her, I'm just her friend. So we were really surprised at how important the connections were, both for the seniors and for the children. So for example, many of the kids called their senior volunteer their best friend. They drew them pictures. And so we have a picture from one of the children that is the child holding the hand of the senior citizen, and they're under this very dark looming cloud that looks really scary, and there's raindrops falling all around except on the two of them. And he explained that that was what it was like to be with her, so that the seniors couldn't necessarily make their life struggles go away, but they offered them a shelter from the storm. They offered them a place to feel understood, to be cared about, for someone to be with them in their pain, and that's really what we're all looking for as human beings. So we've published twice in the International Journal for Play Therapy, which is a journal published by the American Psychological Association, and that's the largest organization for professional psychologists in the world. So we're really excited about that. Like I mentioned before, a lot of times adults misinterpret and misunderstand children's behaviors. And so one of the things that was really exciting about the study that the volunteer senior citizens told us was that they were surprised at how much kids were communicating just through their play. And that was really an amazing experience for them, an aha moment that they had. And really, parents can have that same experience with their children. So one of the things that they could do is to have special play times with their child, and it doesn't have to really even be a long time. It could be 30 minutes a week that's special, and it's on the calendar. And then I'd recommend allowing the child to lead. So for example, a lot of times kids they'll make you some tea or they'll make you some food and they bring it to you, and most adults just eagerly gobble it up and say, oh, yummy. So instead of doing that, we don't want to assume that the child made us something good. Maybe it's poisonous, or maybe the child wants us to not like it. They want us to hate it because they have to eat their broccoli. So they can use what's called the whisper technique, where you allow the child to be the director in their own play. So you simply say, like, what should I say next? And so the parent can allow, or the caregiver, it could be anybody, could allow the child to lead and tell them. And children really relish in having that amount of control in their lives, because if you think about it, kids really don't have a lot of control. We pick them up and we tell them where they're going and what they're going to wear and what they'll be eating, and so they have very little choice in their lives. And so if they don't enjoy their working environment, which is school, they don't get a chance to go somewhere else. They have to go every day. And so secondly, I guess parents or caregivers could offer their children choices. So imagine you're at work and you're talking to your colleague and you're involved in a really important task, and your spouse or significant other comes and says, come on, let's go, we're leaving, get your coat. And you're trying to say, well, wait a second, I'm kind of involved in something important. They're like, stop talking, let's go right now, and gets angry and says, you know, do you want me to pick you up and take you to the car and embarrass you? And so we wouldn't do those things to adults, but we do those things to kids all the time, right? So it's a humorous example, but offering children like a 2-minute warning and giving them some choices about how they leave, or if they put their coat on or get help, or even allowing them a choice of what to wear. So even a toddler can choose between 2 different outfits, whether they're going to wear an Elmo outfit or a non-Elmo outfit. Yeah. Well, a lot of people consider research to be a dry topic, and they kind of roll their eyes and they don't want to necessarily learn about it because it seems like it would be boring. But to me, research is so exciting because it helps us to determine best practices. So we can understand how something works and how to apply it in a real life setting to help people. And so for me, that's why I love research, because I know that we're figuring out ways to better help children, and there's a lot of people benefiting in the process. So one of the things that we were surprised about in the study were the benefits that seniors actually had themselves. So we expected that it would kind of be fun for them to work with kids and that they would enjoy the volunteer process. But what we found in our qualitative research was that it was really especially meaningful to them. So children are not the only ones that are developing. Adults continue to develop throughout their adulthood, and that's an exciting thing about being human. So older adults, for example, struggle with tasks like generativity and integrity. Is my life meaningful? Did I contribute something to the world? And so we have this great, talented, dynamic workforce that have all these skills to offer children, and this model allows them to do that and to gain more meaning from their lives. And really, it's a priceless thing to experience an authentic relationship with a child.
From an early age on, growing up in Europe, I was helping my grandfather in a store. He was a hat maker, and I enjoyed tremendously being with him, selling things, really enjoyed that retail context. Eventually, when I got to the university, I studied retail, came to the United States, continued retail studies. Eventually, in my doctoral program, my dissertation chair got me interested in a very specific type of retail, which is franchising. Now, being from abroad, not being an American citizen, international issues have always intrigued me. And so franchising was one of those areas in retail that allowed me actually to combine, to integrate the international interest with my interest in retail. Franchising is such a global phenomenon today. It is the fastest growing business model in retail, certainly in services that we know. That was kind of a fortuitous confluence of interests, I guess, that got me to that point. We're all familiar with chain stores, like a department store. You have a large parent company, they open their own units, and they employ managers in those units. The managers receive a salary, so they have really typically not much of an incentive to do particularly well or to avoid mistakes. So those stores are run as a chain store. A franchise implies that the individual units are run by owners. So when you think of McDonald's as the quintessential fast food franchise, McDonald's signs a contract with individuals in local communities who own their own restaurants. They invest in building those restaurants. They sign a contract with McDonald's to use their trademark and their entire operating system. The standards, the manual, all of that is part of the franchise. After they make their monthly sales, they keep the vast majority of the money that they earn. They pay a royalty, kind of a fee, a percentage-based fee, to the franchise, either on a bi-weekly or a monthly basis, but they keep the majority of the money. So they have a very strong incentive to do really well with their stores because they have ownership interest in those stores. Franchising, first of all, is dynamic. it moves. When I was in my doctoral program, we were looking mostly at US systems. Over the last 10 years or so, we have moved our focus more towards the big emerging economies, the Chinas of this world, the Indias of this world. More recently, the last 5 years or so, much of the focus has shifted again to other parts of the world. I like to travel. I'm a foreign national. I do think because I've grown up in Europe, I've lived here, I have developed an expertise in a topic that has global importance in industry, in commerce, that I am in some ways maybe uniquely positioned to spread the word, to research this. So when it comes to my research, not just is this something that I enjoy tremendously because of my background and my interest in retail, but it is something that, has taken on almost a life of its own. You develop an expertise, you develop an interest, and people come to you and ask for your advice. They ask for expertise. The academic franchise community is very specialized. We're talking about a group here of folks that come from very different backgrounds. We have legal scholars, we have people from management, from marketing, from hospitality, from a number of different backgrounds. Typically, there's only a couple of people in each of the countries that are represented that actually do this as their mainstay academic research focus. It's a group of about 50, maybe 100 people that do this with a seriously. We all know each other. It's a very tight-knit group because we are so exotic in some ways. At the same time, we represent academically one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing business model globally. Franchising has enormous growth rates, particularly in the emerging economies, in the developing world. Here in the West, it has slowed down. Markets have gotten saturated. Yeah, we are truly global. We're truly a group of experts, and we look at this franchise phenomenon from all of these different perspectives. There's, it's a contractual relationship, and so we have lawyers involved. It's a distribution system, so we have marketing people involved. It's a branding issue. We have people in advertising. It's oftentimes in the hospitality industry, restaurants, hotels, and so forth. So we have the hospitality folks involved. So it's very cross-disciplinary in that sense. Up to this point, I think in academia, we like to, when we do studies and we compare franchises internationally, one of the ways that we actually separate franchises from each other is to say, well, we have over here, we have a group of multinational, very large franchise systems. And then at the local level, of course, we have franchise systems where they only have maybe 20 units or 30 units. And so they seem to be very local, very limited in their resources. And so one of the distinctions that we make is between large international systems and local, relatively small systems. Part of that distinction is that we, I think, traditionally have made the assumption that the larger systems are more sophisticated, they have resources, they can do whatever they want, and they understand this very well. They have contracts that are very refined. And on the other hand, we have maybe these local systems that are not as refined, not as sophisticated, maybe cruder, maybe run by people that don't know the ways of the world as much, maybe. Really what we found in Vietnam was when we looked at these local systems as opposed to the international systems is that distinction really doesn't hold true anymore today. Instead, what we're finding is that the small systems, in their efforts to become competitive with the global systems that are entering their markets, are very sophisticated. Their franchisees have traveled. The franchisors typically hire folks that have worked for the larger systems, hire them away to improve their own systems. And so in the end, you have, even at the local indigenous franchise level, you have systems that are very sophisticated. You have an incredible understanding from the store manager all the way up to the franchisor about how franchising works and what some of the pitfalls are and what to look out for, how to motivate their employees. All of these things are actually at a much more sophisticated level than we anticipated they would be. When you take franchising abroad, franchising has been blamed for and praised for many influences upon foreign cultures. The detrimental effects are the ones that everybody talks about, right? So when you go to a fast food restaurant, you line up in a queue. Well, in many cultures, over in Asia, for example, for the longest time, there were no lines. When people they stood at a bus stop or they went into a restaurant, they wouldn't line up. This was a throng of people trying to get in. Fast food, in many cultures, has introduced lines. People lining up for service. You know, eating food with your hands is, as far as my understanding is, certainly very American when you come to eating a sandwich. In Germany, growing up in Germany, you ate mostly with forks and knives. In Asia, you eat with chopsticks, most of your food. So introducing fast food, American-style fast food, into those cultures means that people all of a sudden, in some ways, start changing their table manners, their eating habits. Fast food restaurants have introduced value meals and condiments, things that were almost unknown in many parts of the world. Ketchup is an American thing. There's positive effects, things that people never think about really. When a fast food restaurant moves into a market that hasn't seen restaurants like this, when you see hotels moving into markets that haven't seen Western-style franchised hotels before, they're introducing standards to the market. Hygiene standards, cleanliness. How often do the sheets have to be changed? The local competitors get pressure. They get pressured to follow the same standards because the local consumer watches what the Western company brings to the table and says, well, their bathrooms are cleaner. Well, their food is fresher. So they have pressure, of course, to comply. And so in many ways, that influx means that locally things change, sometimes for the better, in some cases for the worse. You know, a couple of issues, I think, in addition to this global local conflict, I think there's a couple of other issues that I think are important for the future, I think one thing that we're seeing in franchising, we've seen this for a number of years now, and I think we're going to see more of that, is that franchisees are getting more rights. I think, traditionally a franchise relationship has been characterized by what we would call a power imbalance. You have a very strong, powerful franchisor. They dictate the contract terms to the franchisees, and the franchisees, for the most part, have to swallow those contract terms if they want to become a franchisee. What we have seen some evidence of in the last few years is kind of a pushback by franchisees to gain rights back. So when the franchisor says, we're going to raise prices, the franchisees actually may be able to say, if there's enough of them, to say, no, we really don't want you to raise your prices. I think one other thing that we shouldn't forget is, when we talk about franchising, we talk about the franchisor and the franchisee and the relationship. And some people may think that this is similar to an employer-employee relationship. Franchising is exactly not an employment relationship. And that creates problems. In the past, we've looked at franchising as an incredible vehicle of growth. So if you want to expand quickly, franchising is the vehicle because you have all these individual owners fronting up their money, and the franchisor doesn't have to do that, so they can grow fairly quickly. In the recession that we have experienced the last few years, one of the issues has really become, how do you retrench a franchise system? These franchise owners, these franchisees, sign contracts in the fast food industry, oftentimes 10 or 20 years in length. What happens when out of a sudden a recession hits and the franchisor realizes we have too many stores in a particular market? We can't sustain, the stores can't survive. Well, who's going to leave? This is not a relationship where they can tell one of the franchisees, you're the one that's superfluous here. You need to bail out of the system. So I think there's interesting issues that are arising as franchising as an industry is maturing, because it is a relatively new industry. Franchising goes back in the United States to the late part of the 1800s, and the modern type of franchising, when you look at fast food and hotels, is barely 100 years old, even less than that. So you look at an industry that's relatively new, that has been growing very rapidly, but it is hitting limits. And now the question is, what happens when that market in some ways may have to downsize? And I think that judgment is still out. Well, research is really pushing the boundaries of knowledge. Research, to me, is discovering things that we didn't know before, or that we didn't quite understand before. And to me, that's an incredible thrill. Sometimes it's a long process. It's arduous. It's a process that takes sometimes years to get a study done. You collect data, but before you collect the data, you have to design the survey, and you have to test it and do pilot tests and all kinds of things. Eventually, you get to a point where you conduct the survey, you enter the data, you run the data, and you're finding things that nobody has written about before, that people hadn't thought about before, maybe. And when you find those things and you can talk to others about this is what we do as a scholar, as a professor, right? We do this in the classroom, but we do this also in academic circles, and as I mentioned earlier, to regulators, to people that want our advice, to industry. When you can tell a story, a compelling story about something that people hadn't thought about before, that didn't know before, there's very few things in life, I think, that are more exciting than that.
When I was a kid, I actually followed the St. Louis Cardinals, and Bob Gibson was the great pitcher for the Cardinals in the 60s. And I read his biography, or maybe it's just a story, I can't remember which, in which he described coming out of Creighton University in Omaha and being recruited and then being drafted and being signed up by the Cards and going to some small southern town in which he was just treated awfully because he was black. And I remember as a kid that really I found it disturbing. And so when I went to college, I really it always sort of intrigued me, this idea of control, how people control others, whether it's, regulation, law, or whatever. And so even though I always wanted to be a lawyer, that in the back of my mind, this issue of how people control each other was always part of it. So I did an honors project on slavery in New Jersey, focusing on the question of, why are people enslaved? Well, I'd worked for 20 years as an attorney. I started out as a litigator with the city of New York. I was then counsel of the Buildings Department, and then I was in private practice for 10 years. And at some point, I just realized I was getting a little bored. It was a little too easy. And I'd been spending a lot of time reading history all along, was always interested in it, had taken graduate courses as an undergraduate. And I thought, life is short. Why not take a U-turn? And, the conversation with my wife, we decided that would work. I was sort of intrigued by the idea of going back to do a project based on what I'd done as an undergraduate. I was going to use my legal background as an attorney, so go get court cases. So I'm actually in the Municipal Archive in downtown Manhattan, and I remember this distinctly. It was my end of my first year in graduate school, my MA program, and I look up, it's like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and realize I've got like 8 cases, and they'd say almost nothing. I can't write a thesis on this basis, let alone even think about doing a dissertation. I remember just getting on the subway thinking, oh God, I gave up a really good, well-paying career. I gave up, a certain reputation, and I'm really, I'm in a dead end. I'm in a cul-de-sac. And, to my advisors, everlasting credit, Jan Lewis from Rutgers, Newark, said to me, just go back, relook at what you have. There's something there. You've done a lot of research that you can then try to reframe this. And what happened was I'd done a lot of reading of future slave ads. And at the bottom of a lot of them was this little insert, N period, B period, meaning note below. All masters of vessels are hereby warned not to harbor, employ, or conceal said runaway. So I thought, okay, I'm a guy who likes to count. So I started counting. I was like, wow, like 20% of the ads have this reference. And at that point, so like a light bulb went off in my head. I was like, wait a minute. This means that these guys, both white guys think, masters and sea captains, and runaway slaves think getting away by sea is something that's doable and has a certain benefit that's not true when running away on land. So I went back and looked at it, and I thought, okay, here's a way of now rethinking resistance in a very different way. part of what I was engaged with in the dissertation and subsequent scholarship was this question of exactly why whites be willing to take that risk, what was going on, and what opportunities were offered to blacks when they went to sea. Was this a door to freedom, or was this just meant that it was a different type of employment? For some slaves, in fact, it became a door to freedom. For others, it literally just became a way of working. And so, part of what I've been trying to unpack is who's able to use that maritime experience to a profitable way of moving from enslaved to free, and who can't. Ben Freebody was a slave in 18th century Newport, Rhode Island, who in 1775 negotiated a deal with his owner, Samuel, by which he would go to sea for 3 voyages. And if he, in fact, completed the 3 voyages, the wages that would be paid to him by the ship captain, actually paid to Samuel, would be the basis for Benjamin being freed. Ben sailed out in June of 1775, and later that month, the British Army and Navy landed in Newport and took over the town. Meantime, Ben sailed south, went to Grenada with the ship captain, turned out to be a loyalist, who landed up whipping him, beating him, putting him on 2 slave voyages to Grenada, from Grenada to the west coast of Africa, where he helped enslave other Africans, then did a voyage or 2 to Pensacola and other places in the West Indies, before finally landing up in New York sometime in the late 1770s, half blind from smallpox, beaten and literally homeless. And so in 1784, at the end of the American Revolution, actually after the British have left, he's writing letters to his owners saying, Dear Samuel, you promised me, you're a good man, or am I not free? And so in his letter, it's sort of interesting, he's appealing to Samuel's goodness as a Christian, and also as someone who negotiated this deal. Ultimately, Samuel's actually taken back to Rhode Island, re-enslaved, and in 1790, there's a small pass which Sam gives to Ben, which says, this is to say that Benjamin Freebody has 30 days to look for a new master. He's discontented with me. Great phrase. And if somebody will pay a reasonable price, they can own him. Ben's story really also talks about how individual it is. That as much as we draw these large conclusions, a lot of times the nature of slavery for individuals in the northern colonies, as well as the southern, is very predicated upon individual circumstances. There's an element of contingency. It also goes to the point of, as much as people have agency and argue and negotiate and take their own actions, running away, whatever, there are larger forces, be it war, be it other people with greater military power over you, be it legal proceedings, be it contestations between different empires, that all sort of impinge upon your ability to be free or unfree. And so, Ben is a terribly sad story, but at the same time, too, he's probably more commonplace than the person who runs away and finds freedom. Black mariners are really interesting because these are guys who are moving around this world with the constraints of their skin color and attitudes about their skin color, as well as the fact that large numbers of them are enslaved. And so their choices, their options are constrained and they're difficult, and understanding their individual lives helps us understand how systems work in a world in which people are moving across national, ethnic, cultural, religious boundaries pretty regularly. One of the issues that I think is important is twofold. One is we've lost touch with our maritime history as Americans. When we think about American history, the frontier thesis of Frederick Turner, this idea that basically American history is the movement west, is pretty much what we've all been raised on. But prior to the American Revolution, 90% of the population is within 50 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. They're not looking west, they're looking east. Their connections are into the Atlantic world. They're thinking more about sending their horses from Narragansett Bay down to Jamaica than they're thinking about, movement west and connections west. And so it's the movement west is really much more of a 19th century story. In my period, it's much more Atlantic connections. One of my advisors said to me, why don't you look at British naval records? And so I got a small grant and went to London. And at that point I realized, the British Navy is great. The British government's great in the 18th century. They're compulsive. They keep records about everything. So I started looking at musters, which are literally the crew list, of which they're very meticulous, and realized, There's a guy named Cato. There's a guy named Pompey with no surname. He's clearly African. British men would list their surname. And then when we get into the 1760s, they started listing their place of birth. And I could see people who were born in Guinea or Guadeloupe or Saint Domingue. You realize that's a black guy. And so that became part of a way of trying to figure out who's out there in the Atlantic world, but also where people flee into, because the British Navy is one of the avenues of flight, or one of the avenues of refuge. But when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, I wasn't trying to compile a database per se. I sort of fell into it. So I think when I finished my doctoral dissertation, I had about 7,000 entries. Historians have two tasks. One is to uncover the past that we don't know about now. And the other one is to reinterpret what we already know and say, is there a different way of looking at this? The database, the Black Mariner database, gives us the ability to do both. So a middle school kid in Chicago can look at this and say, oh, here's a way of knowing about this world I knew nothing about. And I could follow a guy named like Anthony Mingus, who's a Spanish mariner who gets captured by the British in 1777, and then ultimately lands up serving in the British Navy for 7 years on 9 different ships. And he can see the movement around the Atlantic world and understand what it means to be free and enslaved, moving through different imperial networks. But for a scholar, a scholar can look at this, and let's say you're a scholar of literature, because each of the entries has the full text of all the records on an individual Black Mariner. A literary person can go through and do a search based upon a particular word and say, oh, what does the word free mean? What does the word black mean? What does the word Negro mean? How often is it used in what context, in conjunction with what other words? And in doing so, do something that I'm not interested in necessarily. I'm not a literary scholar. And literally use that database to tell a different story and come to a different interpretation about this Atlantic world. The first thing that the Black Mariner database does is uncover the past in a way that other people haven't. So I've always been bothered when people make statements like X or Y, and I think, do they really know what they're saying? One of the benefits of BMD, the Black Mariner database for me, is when I make a statement saying, oh, I think that blacks are prevalent on these ships at the moment in time, I can say without sort of questioning my own head, because I know the data's there, And I think what I've done is a pretty important service to the African American community, because literally then they can look at this and say, yeah, that's our history in a very concrete way. It's not predicated upon 8 narratives written by blacks in the 18th century, which is an important historical source. But now there's this whole other data set that's drawn from 35 archives, which they can say, it's here in a very concrete way, and that's really unusual. So it gives people a connection to their past that's not been there in a multiplicity of different stories. And so, for example, somebody who might be from Rhode Island can understand the Ben Free-Body story, or can look at the story of the slaves who worked for Welcome Arnold, which is based upon a series of business records, and there's more than 100 men. And they can literally, if they just looked at the database and said, plugged in Welcome Arnold in 1750 to 1800, they'd find more than 100 different little stories, and they'd see a community in a way that's not in those narratives. And so I think it provides, a window to a world that's literally pretty largely unknown, especially by the general public. I've always said to my non-academic friends, having been a non-academic for many years, what I'm now paid to do is create knowledge. So you can't create knowledge if you're not researching. So, there are very good people here who are teachers, but if you're not a researcher, you're not necessarily creating new knowledge. And so I think that's first and foremost, the function of a scholar. What you research on and the value of that is largely predicated in sort of a marketplace of ideas. There's a contestation whose idea is more important, whose idea is the most interesting. And so for me, the Black Mariner database to me gives me an element of a foundation which I can argue my work is really important because I've got something here nobody else has. So there's that component. I think it's also important because literally, in terms of the students we teach, one of the things that they need to see is a modeling of what it means to be somebody who's deeply invested in a career, and not just an academic career. So when I use the Black Maritime database in the classroom, what I'm hoping that they understand is they're not going to be all historians, very few of them are, but they can see a method of working, of scholarship, that can also be, if I do the long, hard slog, God, he'd spent 10 years in the archives doing this. And so now he can do these exercises with us, that there's benefit to sort of doing something over time in a steady, thought out progression that might not be the one-off that they might be used to in writing a 2-page response paper. And so when I use the database in the classroom, I'm hoping that that sort of question of modeling of how to work gets through. So I think those are 2 things. And also I think the third thing is really, in the end of the day, one of the things that we as scholars generally don't do is connect to the larger public. This issue between scholarship and public history. I mean, we do it here at Eastern in our public history or historical administration program really well. But most historians don't really think about that. And one of the things that I'm excited about the database is that it gives me a way between the database and my blog to talk to people who are non-historians, who are just generally interested, and then maybe it sparks their curiosity to dig a little deeper.